Morning, everyone. My name is Chris Fishlock, as Tom says, and it's great to be able to welcome you to St. Nick's Church. Thank you very much indeed for giving up your time and joining us. I know we've got a number here for the first time. Particular welcome to you. To suggest that Christianity is not compatible with the ability to think rationally is a relatively new idea in our world, but it is, of course, a very popular one. It was back in 1994, the well-known atheist, Professor Richard Dawkins, he famously said this in a lecture: "Faith is the great cop-out, the great excuse to evade the need to think and evaluate evidence." And Dawkins, of course, over the years, has been joined by many enthusiastic co-workers. You will have heard of Daniel Dennett, Sam Harris, the late Christopher Hitchens. Collectively, these four men particularly, and many, many others, put out many interviews and books and blogs. And they've convinced lots of people that the Christian faith is not an intellectually tenable position. More recently, at the launch of one of his books, Dan Brown said that it was only a matter of time before our need for God would diminish and disappear completely. He said, "God can't survive science." And that sort of anti-God sentiment, of course, reasons with many in our world today, and in our city particularly. Here is a journalist. She said, studied anthropology at Cambridge. I couldn't possibly believe in Christianity today. Here's a city lawyer. But people don't rise from the dead. Now, such statements are, of course, said with genuine sincerity. And they contribute to this position, which we are increasingly familiar with. I'm an intellectually robust individual, and I believe that scientific evaluation gives us the foundation for rational thinking today. Conversations about God and about the Christian faith are non-scientific. They are therefore questionable. Hence, our question today, and you may like to sort of refer to the handout you'll see just sort of after that last song, is Christianity rational in 2021? There's a few things I'm going to be drawing our attention to on that handout. Let me just explain what I mean by that question. Is the Christian faith intelligible? Does it make sense today to a thinking person? That means, is it consistent? Is it coherent? Or, as many think today, does the Christian faith rely upon superstition? Does it embrace the irrational? Well, I think it's a very important topic. Let's go back a few hundred years. The 16th century philosopher Francis Bacon, he's considered today to be the father of modern science. And he believed and taught that God has given us two books, the book of nature and the Bible. And he taught that all rational thinking people should study both. Galileo, he was around at a similar time, just after, I think, Francis Bacon, late 16th century, early 17th century, also considered a father of modern science. Galileo is the one who gave us the building blocks, of course, for astronomy as we understand it today. He made huge advances in understanding the planetary system as we observe it. And even recently, NASA named one of their space probes after him because it had discovered, or at least it was sort of exploring things that Galileo had discovered hundreds of years before. Now, it was interesting because in Galileo's day, there was a lot of pressure from the church, from the sort of the wider church, to accept whatever it said about the universe. And Galileo fought against that. He said, "I do not feel obliged to believe that the same God who has endowed us with senses and reason and intellect has intended us to forego their use." True Christianity has never and should never discourage the use of intellect and reason to investigate our universe. Now, Galileo seemed to, we don't know for sure, but he seemed to have a genuine Christian faith. He also said this, I love this quote, he said, "The laws of nature are written by the hand of God in the language of mathematics." There you go. I bet you didn't realize that if you studied mathematics at university. You studied God's own language for putting together the universe. Johannes Kepler, he was around just after, brilliant mathematician, astronomer, 17th century, and he said, all great discoveries are really just a matter of thinking God's thoughts after him, which is a great way of putting it, isn't it? Now, over the last few hundred years, since these fathers of modern science, our world has been discovered and defined by many great philosophers and scientists who were Christians. I've already mentioned Francis Bacon and Galileo and Kepler, well known, but did you also know that Faraday and Boyle and Pascal and Kelvin and Clerk Maxwell were all committed Christians? And that's just to name a few of a long list. These are the people you learn about at GCSE and A-level and study at university. I think we could have a really interesting time considering how these great thinkers had no problem with the claims of Christianity. But even though that is true and could make for quite an interesting morning together, I don't think it's the best way to convince you personally that the Christian faith is indeed rational and believable today, just because a whole lot of other impressive people might have believed it in the past. And that's because ultimately it's not brain power that you need to believe the Christian faith. It is instead, very simply, our willingness to accept factual information about a man, Jesus. True Christianity must be weighed and measured by rational assessment of Jesus. As sure as the birth of Jesus divides our history in two, so the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus divides our world and even our room today into two. And so for the rest of our time together this morning, I'm going to suggest we do something that may be totally new to some of you today. We're going to take the advice of Francis Bacon and apply our skills of rational thought to the message of the Christian faith. In just a moment, I'm going to ask you to consider a statement of the Christian faith. It was written by a man called Paul. He was known as an apostle, a set-apart messenger, and he wrote what I'm going to read out in a moment to a group of Christians. Paul is an interesting character. I mean, he was a leading lawyer of his day. If there had been a magic circle law firm in Jerusalem, he definitely would have run it. He was an impressive character in many respects. He started off his life really hating Christians. And he made it his ambition to try and stamp out the church. And he didn't hold back from using extreme measures until one day, amazingly, he became a Christian. We catch up with Paul after he's become a Christian. It's now AD 56. And he's writing to the church, group of Christians, in a city called Corinth. Corinth, of course, was the melting pot of ideas. Corinth, the place of very highbrow thinking. It's not some sort of sleepy village in Yorkshire sort of place that Tom grew up. This was sort of London-esque. It carried all sorts of very interesting people and public debates at lots of levels. Have a look on the handout. I've written the statement we're going to consider there, at least one of the two. He wrote this: "For the word of the cross is folly to those who are perishing, but to us who are being saved, it is the power of God." It's quite a short statement, isn't it? Just look at it again. "For the word of the cross is folly to those who are perishing, but to us who are being saved, it's the power of God." What I want to do is to convince you that authentic Christian belief comes down to a personal decision, a personal judgment, if you like, about the message of Jesus, his life, his death and resurrection. And so my method is to take that verse that I just read out, that handful of words, and to dissect it a little and think about it. I'm going to throw out a few ideas under three headings: a message, a choice, and a future. You'll see those on that handout. A message, the word of the cross. You see, an honest assessment of Christianity has to come down to the words that are written about it. And that means the words of the cross. That's a statement, isn't it? The words of the cross. Now, of course, that's not the only place we could assess the Christian faith from, but it is a sensible place because it is the heart of the Christian faith. The word of the cross, it's a statement under which we can place, very simply, the whole message of the life and work of Jesus. And that really means the whole Bible. I don't know if you realize that the whole Christian Bible, 66 books, is just a book about one man, about Jesus. The first 39 books, the Old Testament, they are written preparing people for the coming of Jesus. And then the next 27 books, the New Testament, Jesus has arrived. What does that mean for people, for humanity? What are the implications? What's going to happen next? Those are the questions that the Bible answers. It's all about Jesus. And so when we see this statement on the handout today, the word of the cross, the message, it is longhand, if you like, for the whole Bible. We're really considering the whole Christian faith, 66 books of it. What about a shorthand version? That'd be a little bit more handy for dealing with right now, wouldn't it? A shorthand version, well, an executive summary. I think if Paul was here, he'd want to take us to a statement that he makes later on in the same letter. You'll see it there. I put it on the handout. It comes from chapter 15 and verses 3 to 6. That Christ died for our sins in accordance with the Scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised on the third day in accordance with the Scriptures. That's just a reference to the first 39 books of the Bible, to the Old Testament. In accordance with that, Christ was raised, and that he appeared to Cephas, then to the 12, then he appeared to more than 500. Now, it's one of the earliest statements that we have of the Christian faith. So I think it's a great sort of shorthand summary for what we're really talking about. There's a New Testament scholar today called Gerd Lundman. I believe he's German, and he's alive and kicking. He's an ancient historian. And he says, so he's one of the most reliable New Testament scholars today, according to the worlds of academic circles. And he says these words are to be dated within the first 2 years after the crucifixion of Jesus. That's amazing, isn't it? This statement written down within 2 years of the crucifixion of Jesus. And I quote him on that because he is also a well-known atheist and a New Testament scholar. And he accepts that within 2 years of Jesus' death, belief that Jesus had been raised from the dead was so widespread, so common, that creedal statements like this one had been written down. So there we have it, the word of the cross. If you're a rational person, I'd like to suggest, it's upon these words, essentially about the life, the death, and resurrection of Jesus, that your assessment of the Christian faith should be made. I'm going to come back to them shortly. For now, though, I want to see that the message always causes a mixed response. It's always Marmite. Love it or hate it. It's a binary decision in the end. And you'll see that second point. A decision. One of folly or power. Now, just consider the cross for a moment. I mean, the cross was an instrument of torture. It was designed to lead to a very slow and painful death, and it was synonymous with shame. And so clearly, the cross is opposite to anything heroic or macho. There's the choice, a choice of folly or a choice of power. Folly. Folly in the original language, of course, the New Testament was written down originally in Greek. In the Greek, the word folly is moria. It's where we get the word moronic. And that's what lots of people thought of the cross in the days that Paul was writing about it. It's exactly the same today. How could the long-promised king, they've been waiting for 39 books of the Bible and thousands of years, how could God's long-promised king end up on the cross? That is a moronic message. Until you look just a bit closer and ask, why? Why would God, who made this world And after thousands of years of careful preparation of his people, don't worry, my king's coming soon, don't worry, my king's coming soon, why would he then send his son to die on the cross? The cross of all things, the most shameful of deaths imaginable. Because the message is crafted by God to disarm all who would look at it. The inherent weakness of this message from our natural perspective is, of course, the way that God chooses to show his power. Just stand back from that for a moment. I mean, if you're prepared to accept that there is a God who obviously has infinite brain power, then let me urge you to think about the cross afresh. It is the way that God has decided to show his power to us. And of course, to be able to see God's power, we need to come down from our high horses, our natural pronouncements of the status of moronic against things that look unheroic. We need to come down off our high horse that says, I know best, I'll make decisions, my intellect, my assessment of science, that's the place to start. We need to come down off that high horse so that we can see the personal relevance. Remember that creedal statement under point 1. Christ died for our sins in accordance with the Scriptures. Christ died for our sins in accordance with the Scriptures. It was always promised that Christ would have to die. This was the plan. Look at those first 5 words again. Christ died for our sins. Sin is very simply pushing God out of our life. We often just think, don't we, that sin is sort of the list of bad things that we do. But actually, those bad things are just a symptom of a larger problem. The root problem, the root cause, if you like, is living in God's world without reference to him. And that takes many different forms today: atheistic, agnostic, apathetic. Essentially, sin is the proud stance which says, when it comes to my life, I know best. I'll decide. I'm in charge. Do you see? The cross is so brilliant because it deals with my sin. The very thing that stops me being able to understand it is the thing that the cross deals with. And God, being so infinitely kind and gracious, decided to give what I deserve to Jesus. He suffered and died on the cross, not for anything he did. You look at the life of Jesus, you'll very quickly see he did nothing wrong, nothing deserving of death. He was innocent at every respect. Yet because of what I did, when Jesus died, he took my sin. He died and he took it to the grave. All my sin taken, and yours, if you will believe. Jesus didn't stay dead. Jesus rose from the dead. That proves that my sin was properly dealt with. This wasn't a makeshift brush under the carpet routine. This was complete. That's why Jesus rose. And that message is so simple and so profound that the great minds and intellects of our world can sometimes miss it, and yet amazingly, small children can grasp it. I wonder what you make of it. What do you personally make of this message? It really takes humility. It's not something we like to show or exercise, is it? It really takes humility to admit that you have sin. It takes even more humility to accept that someone else, not you, has to deal with your sin. That takes real humility. You see, the message of Christianity ultimately stands against human pride. Pride says, I don't need God. Pride says, I'll make up my own decisions my way. And the cross proves that we do need God. That's why God spent 39 books preparing people for the fact that one day his son would come and die. And if we're prepared to think about this for just a moment or two, we might see a different perspective on this message. Not folly, not the moronic diagnosis that perhaps we've applied in the past, but instead power. Not power we're used to in this world. Displays of power in this world don't look like the cross, but here is God's power. And that leads us to the final point, thirdly, to see why it matters. This is where it gets really personal, because of course our futures, your future personally, is at stake. Perishing or saved. We're not talking about the next few decades as you make life choices and career choices and live life in this world. We're talking about eternity. Look at that verse right at the top again, where we began. For the word of the cross is folly to those who are perishing, but to us who are being saved, it's the power of God. Do you see there are two groups of people? There are those who are perishing, and then there are us, Christians, who are being saved. But notice in both cases, it is a state not fully realized yet. For those perishing, well, there is worse to come. It is a warning. For those being saved, there is better to come. We're not there yet. So, as we draw to a close, is Christianity rational? The question really is, I'd like to turn it round a little bit. Can you, a rational person, become a Christian? I hope it's really clear this morning. This is not about IQ. It's got nothing to do with your level of intelligence. In God's infinite wisdom, he's decided to use a message about Jesus' death on the cross to split our world into two groups. And so can I urge you to consider afresh these words, this statement, because it's upon this statement and your personal assessment of it that ultimately defines whether you're in one group or the other. Look at these words again. Christ died for our sins. And that includes your sin today if you are somebody who decides to trust in Jesus. Christ died for our sins in accordance with the Scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised on the third day in accordance with the Scriptures, and that he appeared to Cephas and to the 12, and then he appeared to more than 500. That's where the assessment must be made. And it's upon that assessment that your future is decided. Well, there's some things to think about, and I hope that's something that will provoke a little bit of discussion and thought. We're going to have just a moment now. I think Tom's going to explain. Look, a few questions, Tom, is that right? Over to you.
I thought I'd just, Chris, if you stay with me, I'd ask you a couple of questions, if that's all right. Just to sort of follow up, in terms of if we want to take what you've said further, the second point there, a decision. So any tips for examining, exploring the New Testament, the Gospels, if we want to do that for the first time?
Yeah, I think it's really important to consider these words for yourself. In a sense, one of the best places to start, if it all does revolve around, as we said today, that the word of the cross, the message of Jesus Christ, his life, his death, his resurrection, then why don't you read, perhaps for the first time in your adult life, read one of the accounts of Jesus' life yourself. You could start with one of the gospel accounts, Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John. Have a look at one of those. I'd say, I think we've got some John's Gospels out at the back. They're a great place to start. Probably take you about 2 hours from start to finish to read through. John, who wrote down John's Gospel, John was one of Jesus' close friends, and he knew him personally. He had some questions, no doubt, as he was going, but he put together a very carefully organized document, eyewitness material, so that we could get to know Jesus too. And John's done it. So that would be, to answer your question, that would be the place to start. Go to John's Gospel, take a copy. I'm pretty sure, I'll make sure at the end that, yes, I'm getting a nod at the back. We've got some copies out there, free, grab one, take it away, and spend a few hours over Easter reading it. You'll probably have questions. Why didn't you ask the person that invited you today those questions? because we're dealing with the most important issue here. This isn't just a life choice. This is something that's going to have eternal consequences. So it's worth really putting a few hours aside to do that.
We've been saying this morning that at the heart of Christianity is relationship with Jesus, and that's very much what we're seeing, that there is a personal decision. But what do we actually mean? What does it look like to respond in this way to Jesus?
That's the wonderful thing about the Christian faith, true Christianity. I mean, so many people's dismissal of the Christian faith is a dismissal of sort of organized religion. It's, you know, you've heard about the Christian faith and you think it's all about going to church and saying prayers and strangely dressed people and priests and just weird ceremony. And you've dismissed that because you think that's a bit irrelevant. And I agree with you, it is irrelevant. It's got nothing to do, really, with true Christianity. True Christianity is, as Tom said in that question, about a relationship. And so if you take on board that first challenge, that it's all about getting to know Jesus through those gospel accounts, take on board that first challenge, and you will find you actually get to know somebody. I mean, that is how we get to know people, isn't it? Through information. You get to know your friends as you chat to them, whether it's on Snapchat or Facebook, depending on your generation, or whether it's actually if you pick up the phone and speak to them. You can do that, you know, your phone actually, you can speak to people live. It's really useful. And so, you know, these are different ways you can actually communicate with people. And this is how we get to know people. As we pick up one of the gospel accounts, we hear firsthand from somebody that knew Jesus personally, we hear about the person Jesus. That means we begin to enter into some type of relationship. And as we get to know Jesus, we meet somebody like no other. Jesus himself said, if you want to know what the Father, what God is like, then get to know me, get to know him. And so, yeah, we do enter into a relationship. But it's not a sort of a relationship out at a distance, a sort of like you get to know historical figures that were interesting and of some relevance who did amazing things. It's not just like that. This is a historical character who you can actually enter into a personal relationship that has use for you today. Because, of course, his life, his death, his resurrection becomes of personal relevance.
Chris, that's very helpful indeed. Thank you very, very much.